Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 60th episode of By-The-Bywater. It is great to be back with you all. We hope things are going well with you. We made it to the end of February when we're recording this. Yay. So, I think we're all in one piece-ish. Maybe that's the best way to put it. So at least I hope we are. So, and all that other stuff. We are, collectively, I think we're just sort of waiting for spring.
Yeah.
I don't think we have any sort of major news on our parts. I mean, it's my birthday Friday, but by the time this episode comes out, it will be past my birthday, so yay.
I mean, do you have all your birthday gifts ready to give us?
Yeah. I was going to ask that, actually.
You found me out. I still have time, though. I still have time.
Yeah.
Actually, why did I say Friday? I'm taking Friday off. It's actually Saturday. Never mind. And the only thing that I hope to get as a birthday gift on the Tolkien front is not from you guys, but would be my deep suspicion, not confirmed at all by anybody anywhere. I've heard nothing about this, that with the Dune Part 2 movie about to come out, we're going to get some sort of teaser for War of the Rohirrim, which I am convinced is going to happen. It is a Warner's film. It's a big event movie.
Hopefully.
Strikes me as a very logical place to put this. So at least a teaser, not a full trailer necessarily. We will see. So if I'm right, I'm right. We'll find out by the time this episode comes out. Otherwise, we don't have much to say, so let's just, and too much to throw on to, my brain is dead. Let's get into the episode. Let's get to the news. Then I'll have something to say. So Jared, please do take it away. Get the giggles out now. Yes.
Yeah.
No, leave the giggles in. Leave the giggles in. This is hilarious.
It is genuinely delightful that for so many episodes, it feels like in a row, we've just been able to have really hilarious news rather than like look at crap that's going down or whatever. There's not much direct news, but we do have a little something that is amusing, obviously, the hell out of us here. You might remember that last episode we had a small mention of some really, really weird rumors about what the Rings of Power Season 2 would involve, a lot of which sounded unlikely at best and completely impossible and ridiculous at worst. These have been posted at spots like theonering.net, and we were definitely skeptical, with Oriana saying they sounded like planted stories to figure out who leakers might be. And surprise, the Fellowship of Fans Twitter account posted on February 21st to say that that was in fact the case, supposedly happening over the last 6 months, and that they would stop posting their own similar scoops in response until they could provide any updates from our investigation as to whether they had been completely taken in, which we suspect is pretty obviously the case. Notably, the OneRing.net hasn't posted anything about this at all in response, and of the two kinds of silence, suspicious and embarrassed, we tend to feel it is more the latter, and we'll leave it at that.
This is great. This is so great. A of all, I'm so happy to be right. Nothing compares. Nothing compares.
Is this the type of thing, like planting fake rumors, that, in your knowledge, and I'm not pretending you have the keys of the kingdom or anything like this, is this the type of thing like planting fake rumors is like regularly the case with a lot of productions or things like that? Or?
I don't think that's like a sort of modus operandi of
industry standard.
Yeah, like, when I was...
And the Oscar goes to...
When I was reporting on, like, the TV industry and doing things that were sort of like TV criticism adjacent, I'd write about specific episodes of TV and season premieres and that sort of thing. And in order to, like, interview people before the piece came out, like, I would have to either watch the episode or, like, know what happens. And you would occasionally have to... I don't know if I ever like signed an NDA for that reason, but like it was more just like, Matt Weiner has those infamous now letters that he would send to TV critics where but before every season premiere of Mad Men, where he would have an exhaustive list of what he considered to be spoilers and were therefore verboten from being mentioned in critical reviews. But feeding spoilers is, I think, because spoiler culture has kind of died a bit. Like, honestly, maybe it's because I no longer participate in spoiler culture and haven't for like over a decade.
Good for you.
Right? It just feels as though it's something that just very few people actually still kind of participate, and so like you just don't need to. So it's pretty funny that these guys got so badly. And was it the Fellowship of Fans or some?
It was Fellowship of Fans that specifically posted the thing that we noticed. I caught some report on some other site, but yeah, it was there.
The other site was really funny, where it was like, please don't say I was mad.
That was bizarre. Yeah, that was. I went to the source when I was writing up this news magazine because we first heard about it. Some other site was going like, oh no, they're ruining season 2, Seasons of Power. I'm like, you're ruining yourself. Who are you? What are you? There's a weird layer of fan culture out there I refuse to acknowledge at this point, because clearly these people.
It's a little embarrassing,
right?
It's just a little.
Please
bit.
Act like you've been here. Please act like you've been here.
Yeah, I feel like they've gotten more gullible. That one site has gotten a little more gullible over the years.
Yeah. I was thinking about that earlier. I was sort of like, man, 25 years ago was a lot different to now in terms of what the One Ring is doing in terms of spy and spoiler reporting. And, it's always been a weirdly symbiotic relationship once the Jackson production sort of realized what was going on and all that. But, this is...
Yeah, like you don't want to lose access to the juicy bits by being too critical, but also, come on, you gotta...
And I was thinking that if I remember right, they pulled something like this before for Rings of Power, in the sense that I seem to remember something, this occurred to me just a few minutes ago, that when they were filming the first season, they supposedly had like a separate unit doing something, filming something entirely, and people were sort of like, they were having that as their kind of like distraction or something like that. I remember this is, when Amazon could spend like, even more money than they would now. Now that the bottom of streaming has fallen out, or however you want to look at it, but
Oh, and there were the fake sides that again are kind of like more or less. Yeah. That is, I guess, like that does feel kind of a piece with the feeding of false information to outlets to try and do a mole hunt, which sounds so much more exciting than it actually. Like, none of this matters. Are you guys kidding me?
It's also telling, I think, that the only people really reporting on it were the hyper-focused Tolkien fan sites. I don't recall any of the actual media fan sites, or even the big ones with sort of like, I don't even recall something at IO9 or anything about it. If there
I'm
was,
going to guess because it just wasn't a traffic driver.
That's probably part of it too. Yeah, the whole thing feels embarrassing all around, honestly. Yeah. So it really does. Yeah. It's sort of like, another comparison point you're going to think of is, the Super Bowl happened a couple of weekends ago, and if you remember 2 years ago, the big run-up was they had the first footage shown at the Super Bowl. There was the big Vanity Fair piece. It was sort of like, Rings of Power coming in, and now here we are with the second season coming some point this year, and boy, sure isn't as much publicity as there.
Awful quiet.
What was it? It lost like 75% of its audience before the season ended, or something like that. Nobody wants to watch it.
Yeah, it just we'll go on about it. At some point a trailer will surface. Yay! We're not gonna.
Can't wait.
Yeah, we're not going to do any sort of emergency episode for that one. Let's put it that way. Let other people do that. So, well, beyond that, and waiting on whatever we are going to wait on in terms of Werther here, or something else maybe, you never know. We do have a main topic, and it is Jared's choice, and it's a good one. So, Jared, please, the floor is yours.
What? I love that first word. What? The glory of Oxford in days of old we have heard tell, how those dons did deeds of valor. Of Tolkien lectured on lays and halls where students slumbered. He whose words redefined Beowulf criticism forever, lost the alliteration. That was a good professor. It's a little bit over.
I want to clap. Like, that was so good. I'm so impressed.
Real talk. I knew this would be a big topic, but I realized I was in over my head when I started researching in earnest and discovered Wikipedia has an entire article on Beowulf's influence on Lord of the Rings. So we're just gonna do what we're gonna do here.
Non-exhaustive.
Non-exhaustive. No. This This is the final word on the entire subject of Beowulf forever. Get your hopes way up. First, let's consider this scene. A king sits in a mead hall with his court. He has a terrible problem. In walks a group of heroes after leaving their weapons at the door. One of the king's advisors is unbearably rude to the heroes who deal with the problem anyway and gain the king's friendship forever. And let's consider another scene. A dragon lies sleeping on its hoard. In stumbles a thief who takes a gold two-handled cup before leaving. The dragon awakes, discovers the theft, and in a fit of rage, destroys the countryside before ultimately being killed. It's Beowulf. It's also Lord of the Rings, and it's also The Hobbit. These are the two most obvious examples of Beowulf's influence on Tolkien, but there's so much more, from these big ones down to like surprising tiny little moments. But I guess it's a little background. Time for a little background. Beowulf, if you've been living under a rock for the last 1,000 years, is an Old English epic poem. In it, the titular main character goes to Denmark to deal with a monster for King Hrothgar. He does, and then also gets rid of the monster's mother for good measure. Later, as a king in his own right, he has to face a dragon that is ruining his land. This encounter goes less well, and the poem ends with the dragon dead, Beowulf dead, and his kingless kingdom facing the threat of invasion. It is a fun time. Unironically, like, I genuinely love Beowulf. But what I want to talk about in this episode isn't just the poem, although, again, I do love it. It is worth talking about, obviously. But what I'm also really interested in here is the sort of symbiotic relationship between Beowulf and Tolkien. Famously, insofar as this kind of thing can be famous, he wrote an essay called Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics. Based on a few lectures he gave in the mid-1930s, this redefined Beowulf criticism entirely by focusing on the poem not as a source of historical information, which it sort of is, but mostly isn't, focusing on it as a work of art with its own themes, its own goals, its own sort of poetic intent. And what's funny about this essay nowadays is that this redefinition is no joke. Everything that comes after it is working from some or all of his assumptions, so that if you started with more recent Beowulf stuff, like Seamus Heaney's translation that everybody's read, or Maria Devana Headley's even, like looking back at this essay, revisiting it after 80, how long, and whatever, it almost seems like he's pointing out the obvious, like, oh, of course we should consider it as a poem, duh. But it wasn't obvious at the time, apparently. And because he so thoroughly reset this field, like half of the stuff he's reacting to, I feel like, has been cleared away. So it comes across almost as if he's tilting at windmills. Like, look at this, look at this chump over here in Cambridge or whatever. And it's like, who's that? We don't know who that is, because this essay wiped the slate clean. So we are talking about Beowulf. We're also talking about this essay. We are also talking about Tolkien's own translation of it, which wasn't released until 10 years ago. And to that end, I will open with my first question. Did you like his translation?
Ooh, yeah. I had the book for some time, and but this was my first real chance to sort of like, get into it. And, there's no way this could have been published as it stood. It's so clearly his own, crib notes version of something that he can use to sort of like pick out something in the poem at any point and say to some recalcitrant undergrad who doesn't know Old English for some reason, and say, this is what is happening here type thing. So, which is, and it is truly, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, is a positive, artless. Rather, it is barely has any sense of art to it. It is something that is trying to convey something that is, it's in prose. I mean, that's all you need to know, really. It is something that is barely sort of keeping the things there. It's more like that's kind of my take on it. It was interesting for a lot of reasons because it reminded me what the subject of it all is and what's going into it. But it was one of those things that I was sort of like going like, oh boy, this would have, this would have been much more polished in many different ways if you ever decided to do something formal with it. That's kind of my take on his translation.
Yeah.
Being a prose translation of a poem is simply like, would you like some cake without any sugar in it? Like, that's kind of.
I think you can do it. You can do a prose translation, and it would be fine. But I think part of his problem, and this is full disclosure, I placed a hold on the wrong book at the library and did not get. He had an essay about translating Beowulf, which would have been so valuable. I am so sorry I didn't read it, but I believe in that he refers to. The language of Beowulf, even for Old English, is very archaic. It's self-consciously old-fashioned at the time it was written. So he thinks that when you translate it, you have to kind of match the archaic nature of it, and I don't think it's entirely successful. It is in his hands because he's way too in his head about making it sound archaic. And you don't need to do that, I think.
the notes that go along with translation are like quite in-depth, and that's very cool. But a lot of it does, again, kind of feel tilting at windmills. A lot of it is in response to other translations, other attempts, and it's just kind of exhausting, which is kind of like...
It's very inside baseball.
This sounds very negative. I actually didn't not enjoy it.
Yeah.
Which sounds weird, because there are points at which the rhythm of the original kind of pokes through despite everything, and that you get this beautiful sense of like, right. I found myself reading this version and the Seamus Heaney concurrently, essentially. Like I had the two books with me, and I would make references to the Old English just to be like, what was like happening here? Like, what, what's the original? And I would try and find the original, because it does make you want to, like, that's maybe where it's most successful, is that it makes you want to dive into the poem as a poem.
Yeah, I do. I like when he's talking about translating things like the Old English kennings, like which is for those who don't know, is a poetic term for a compound word that replaces. It's a sort of a synonym for another word. Like the sea is like a Homeric epithet. I don't know if that's helpful to anybody, but it is to me. Where the sea, instead of being called the ocean or the sea or whatever, it will be called the whale road.
Except he hated whale road
because it sounded like railroad. The place
really
where the Gannet bathes. Yeah,
I loved seeing that it's originally Whale Way, essentially.
Yeah, and seeing how he chooses to solve that problem, because he doesn't want it to look silly, like calling it the Whale Road, for a variety of reasons that he brings up, which are all good, and we'll go with like some other, like the place where the whales ride.
Yeah, or they go play, or things like that.
Which is that's nice. It's okay. I don't know if I would have done that if it were up to me, but I like reading his notes on his thought process. I find that kind of thing fascinating. So
yeah, for me, I think what's valuable about the text Beowulf as published by Christopher Tolkien was collected there was that one, Christopher is very open right from the get-go in the notes, saying, "Look, this is a collage. There is a whole mess of he basically is indicating the whole thing was always in flux, and he was sort of like, do I do this or do I do that? Do I try?" And basically says, this is as good as it gets. And he's sort of, I think he's realizing its own esotericness. I think it's great, no lie, that there is enough of a Tolkien industry that you can really get into this. But I think he's also realizing that he's kind of reaching the limits of, okay, who's really going to go for this, and what will he get out?
How useful is it?
Yeah.
How can I make it more useful than it is? Probably not, but here you go anyway.
Right. And as such, what's interesting about it is I think it's the closest thing, and I've been thinking about this in context of the fact, we just did the letters and all that, and that in some respects, this we're getting more into what Tolkien actually did in the real world, I guess is the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
The letters helped in terms of just his vision, his personality, what he did. This is what he did in terms of sort of like his teaching methods, what he's using. It's not a lecture by lecture or class by class thing by any means, no. But it is something that he regularly taught, regularly did, and there are that's very much part of the professor lifestyle, the academic lifestyle, is that whatever research or other things you're doing, you are often doing certain standard classes in rotation, coming back to them, and over time he's worked on this, and so like, well, I've got this, and over time he's like, well, maybe I'm redoing my thoughts, and then you get this detailed, sometimes interesting morass. I think Oriana's point about there is something in the notes which, oof, boy, those the commentary really is
They
involved.
were hard to get through.
Very hard to get through. There was a lot of I was skimming at plenty of points, but what I did was, when he wasn't like delving into specific little meaning things, every so often he would go off on very interesting tangents, sort of explaining, well, there's this or that, or sort of like, and I got a sense of sort of the type of thing that he would use, again, maybe as his own sort of like little thing to build on, is sort of like, okay, what am I going to talk about beyond simply this drill down detail? It could be an interesting detail for a class, something that I could bring up and sort of like, a little something sort of stick in the mind of a listener and all that. That was kind of my sense of it, at least.
Yeah, I did appreciate the notes as well, because they kind of, you can see him, I don't know the time frame exactly on this, it's probably in the book somewhere and I forgot, but you can see him working towards what will become the essay in some places that redefines it, and he's talking about like, well, one of his points in the essay is a lot of people at the time, apparently, again, we forgot them because he came along.
He ethered them.
Yeah, totally. What a comparison. Tolkien dropping bars.
looking at the poem as like a source of historical information, or like, what does this say about Scandinavia in 500, or like, when was it written, and really focusing on it as a historical document. And what he was more interested in is, again, as I said in the introduction, is it like as a poem, what is it doing? What is the function of all of these things? And there are people at the time who are criticizing it for like having too many monsters or whatever. And it's like, no, the monsters are essential, but also all of these digressions that it goes off on, these historical side things, like the story of Ingeld. And I'm not an Old English scholar. I don't probably pronounce everything incorrectly.
Oh, yeah,
like,
huge problem for me, like pronouncing anything.
Some of it I know. Like, I actually half took an Old English course once. But some of it I don't know. I get tripped up on the G's a lot. Like, is it Ingeld or is it Inyeld? I think it's Ingeld. But anyway, I'm digressing, so he'd appreciate me. He finds these digressions valuable on their own, as not as historical information, but as a storytelling technique. Because one thing that he brings up by this term once in the essay, but really talks a lot about but in other ways, is the impression of depth. Like, by referring to so many incidents that are totally peripheral to the main narrative, you have this powerful sense that this poem is coming out of a place and a time where these things happened. And you can see that, like he's talking about that in the notes, he gets really into it in the essay, and then you see it happen in his own work in Lord of the Rings. Yes. Particularly The Hobbit, a little less so, where he'll refer to things like Gondolin or the wild kind of Ara, and like somebody was hunting and you're like, if you're just reading the book, you have no idea what that means. And he has the context for it for himself, and if you read the Silmarillion, it's there. But it's an artistic technique in its own right.
Yeah, there's the passage in The Monsters and the Critics, the one paragraph that absolutely hit me really hard. It was sort of like, oh, here it all is. He's laying out what he likes and what he's doing is this one, and I'll read it. This is from, if you have the book, it's from the book The Monsters and the Critics, which does also have his essay on translating
That's
Beowulf.
The one I couldn't get from the library.
I didn't get that copy either. I got the one with Selleck Spell.
Yeah, no, I got that. No, this is a separate... So for the listener at home, there is...
Oh, wow. We all had a different copy.
No, so there is the edition of Beowulf with Selleck Spell that came out 10 years ago, which has his prose translation. There is a book just called The Monsters and the Critics, which has the essays that we are talking about. And then there is what I got instead of The Monsters and the Critics, which is a tiny little book that is just the essay The Monsters and the Critics, and it's so old, the one that I have, that it actually does not have a death date for him.
Wow.
Dang.
So,
but at least you have it. So I'm reading from the anthology collection, The Monsters and the Critics, which has all the other essays, and there's a bit from the On Transcending Beowulf I will probably want to read later. But yeah, here's the key paragraph leapt out to me. I'm sure it did for you too, Jared. Quoting from page 27. Beowulf is not an actual picture of historic Denmark or Geatland or Sweden about AD 500, but it is, if with certain minor defects, on a general view a self-consistent picture, a construction bearing clearly the marks of design and thought. The whole must have succeeded admirably in creating in the minds of the poet's contemporaries the illusion of surveying a past, pagan but noble and fraught with a deep significance, a past that had itself had depth and reached backward into a dark antiquity of sorrow. This impression of depth is an effect and a justification of the use of episodes and allusions to old tales, mostly darker, more pagan, and desperate than the foreground. And again, that's, that is Tolkien saying, hi, Lord of the Rings. To a real strong degree. It absolutely carries over. You're totally correct there, Jared. Yeah.
I think I would just want to bring it up because it is huge. It's important. And that is, therefore, indirectly, Beowulf is responsible for this sort of ghastly focus on world building these days in modern fantasy. So, we'll leave that aside.
I do think it's interesting, like, his really defensive defense of the Beowulf poet. Like, it comes across as a little try-hard sometimes. I think that's which is bound in, which is, like, he clearly sees himself in, or I don't know, it seems like, to me, he sees himself in the Beowulf poet and feels a deep kinship with this person who wrote this stuff down and, like, was conflicted, was like, well, there's all this, like, pagan shit in here, and, like, I am not a pagan, and I have to kind of reconcile this, and here's how I'm going to do it. Like,
yeah, I do think part of that has to do with it being kind of an artifact of its time, where there were probably, from what he says in the essay, it sounds like there are people who were like, this thing was assembled by a total fool, who had no idea what he was doing, and he's trying to pull back and go, no. If you look at that, like all of these digressions, all of this stuff that you are thinking is bad is actually essential.
It's good, actually,
to the poem. Yeah, it's good. It's essential to a poem as a work of art. So it is a response. But I like that point. I hadn't considered that he saw himself in the poem.
It just feels that way, I think, because it's so strenuous, or like to me it felt strenuous, and that's good. Like, we all have passions in life,
especially since at this point, of course, in his life, when he's making these points, given when the essay was originally put together and written and delivered and all that, most people in the universe did not know he was doing something similar. So he's basically explaining, isn't this great? With this hidden subtext of like me, as most people would be like, they wouldn't know that. So
because we don't know the mindset of the poet. We don't know, we have no way of actually knowing.
You can guess at some of it, but you can't know. Yeah,
we can never fully know. Like, maybe sometimes people do stuff and it actually isn't that great, and it just happens to survive. I love Beowulf. I think it's like art and amazing, but sometimes you're like, why are we talking about this other queen when we were talking about, oh gosh, there's like one, her name starts with an M. We just kind of leave off.
Oh, it's like Morthroth or something like that.
And we're like comparing her, and there's like a whole big, and we're like, oh, okay. I mean, fine, but
this is a total digression from Tolkien, but some people have theorized, or used as a thought experiment at least, the notion that Beowulf was written by a woman, because it keeps bringing up women when you don't necessarily need to.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's heavy air quotes around need to, because women are people and belong in stories. Hot take, I guess. I don't know.
There are more women in Beowulf than there are in The Hobbit.
Yeah.
Correct.
What can I say?
So having that constant comparisons to bringing up queens, that kind of thing is maybe, like, if you think of it as being written by a woman, like, well, maybe that's what's doing there. But it's also, this is something that Maria Devana Headley points out in her introduction to her translation, is that there's a huge focus on kingship in the poem. There's a repeated phrase that I can't remember the exact Old English, and I wouldn't be able to pronounce it anyway, probably. That was a good king.
Yeah.
Like, it's
that was good king.
Kooning, yeah. That was good kooning, I think. Anyway, it's concerned with kingship and the role of a king and, like, what that means and all of that in this time and place. But it is also very concerned with what a queen is, how a queen wields power. So you see Wealhtheow, Hrothgar's wife, as a gift giver, kind of almost like a Galadriel figure, except with less power. Like, she's always coming in and, like, reinforcing the, like, civilized nature of the hall that she's in. And then you get all of these other queens who are mentioned, who are, I think the term is like peace weavers. Like, you give your daughter in marriage to cement an alliance, and her job is to be essentially a diplomat. So there is a subtler focus on the role of a queen, which is why you get this random digression about this other person. And I can't remember where it falls in the poem, and I can't find it right now.
It's towards the end. It's like Hygd.
Hygd?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who is Higlac's wife.
Yeah, and she's like the good one, but she's being compared to, like, isn't she better than this other, like, this awful bitch or whatever?
Yeah, she was such a bitch.
That was a good bitch.
That was bitch.
Oh boy. Now we're getting to a whole different version of us here. I was thinking I should drop in, maybe we should say a little more, because we may well have listeners. You were talking about Beowulf, and obviously we can't go into all of it, but just a little more about what this is and why we're even talking about it, because you brought up a good point earlier. Maybe around it, the idea, I think it was Oriana, the idea of what actually survived, and the reason why that Beowulf has gotten so much attention is that it is the longest work of fiction, for lack of a better term, or something creative, not a chronicle, for lack of a better term, that is in Old English that survives. In other words, we don't know if this is the equivalent, I'm going to be stretching a bit here, but bear with me, of the equivalent of an airport paperback as opposed to some real lost genius somewhere who things like that. That's flippant, but there we are. To not go into it, because again, it would take forever. If you want, Wikipedia will give you all the basics. It really will.
This is a whole academic field. We're not going to get to it.
But there's the key key things to note are simply that there is some debate about because again, we only know so much about it. We don't know exactly when it was composed. We don't know if it was actually transmitted orally and then written down. And the ultimate reason why we don't know much about it is it all comes from one copy. One copy that was in that's called I think it's called the Noel Codex or something like that. Yeah, that's it. And the idea was it's only ever first talked about in any sort of record in some discussion between whoever had this. There's, again, the whole story's in there, in like 1700. So in other words, this was not something that was really truly known, at least in of a time until fairly recently. We're talking the last few centuries, as opposed to something that had come down through antiquity and everybody knew about it for centuries from the time of its creation.
Yeah,
and
we're not dealing with like the Iliad here,
right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a very good comparison point.
And even the Old English itself, there are so many terms that, if you look through the commentary, we don't really know what exactly these words mean. We can kind of guess, and there's also huge grammatical issues where subjects subjects passages will just change. It'll be like he, and then it will be like they, and not in like a he, they.
Well, so this is so funny to me. This is we're straying from Tolkien a little bit here, which is fine, but there is one theory that this is the manuscript that we have is a record of an oral performance, and so there's like errors like that where it's like maybe somebody reciting it made mistakes, but also we know that two people transcribed it. There are two. It switches hands at some point, and the first scribe was very particular and careful about what they were doing, and they were even like changing terms to match what they thought was correct language. And then the second scribe is a lot hastier and does not try to correct what they're hearing, so you get like a more accurate picture of what was actually being said to them, but it is like a little rougher and they make like different errors. I think that's so endearing to me. I don't know.
I love that. And Jared, I can see how that would appeal to you in particular.
Yeah.
Buy the West Passage, pre-order the West Passage,
coming in a few months. So
God.
Well, maybe to get back to the point about tying it back into Tolkien. So again, we could delve into the Monsters of Critics, indeed, and the translating Beowulf, which again I may mention a little more about in a bit. Both certainly worth good reads. But talking about it again as an influence, on Tolkien, what's interesting is that, of course, what he doesn't do in Lord of the Rings with it. He clearly, and Hobbit, as Jared pointed out in his introduction, he's borrowing a lot. At the same time, and his translation actually brought it home to me pretty well, actually, even in his sort of rough stage, is that if you read it and you just sort of come into it, Beowulf just seems like a bit of an asshole.
Yeah.
I love him.
He just comes off as something of a boasting jerk. I mean, sure, he has to deal with his own boasting jerk back at him in Unferth, the character who gives him crap when he gets to Harrod Hall. But it occurs to me that, if another mind could have, been like, I will be inspired to my own epic fantasy, and they do their own version of Lord of the Rings, but it would be one where there would be no hobbits, the hero was Aragorn solely, and Aragorn was kind of a jerk.
Yeah, this is the E.R. Edison approach.
If you
basically.
will. If you will, yes.
Yeah. No, it is interesting how he reworks he takes the thing that inspired him and then does his own thing with it. Yeah, we have the focus on the hobbits. We also have things like when Beowulf goes to Harrod and solves the Grendel problem. The equivalent scene in Lord of the Rings is not really equivalent at all. There is some superficial similarity, but what happens is more like the monster here is depression. So he'll set up, he's more interested than the Beowulf poet in how a monster functions psychologically in the poem. Like Smaug isn't just a dragon who takes a horde and that's it. He takes the homeland of the dwarves basically, and it's much more personal and much more fraught with emotion than Beowulf being like, I gotta get rid of this dragon. That's more of I don't know.
Animal control. Almost.
Animal control, yeah. And it goes it's very, yes. I love the episode with the dragon and Beowulf.
It is so good.
Yeah, but it has much more of a you're marching towards your fate vibe, which is fine. but it's very different from what Tolkien is interested in, which again is like what a monster means to the people who are dealing with it.
What is interesting about the story is that it's not that the point of view necessarily changes. I mean, the narrator as a character, for lack of a better term, is an interesting person. But yeah, we get these weird little dives into the societies, for lack of a better term, on all these different points along the way. And it's not like we have this uniform sense that everyone's all in agreement. It's more sort of like, what about this? Well, then what about, and some people are introduced and then go away really quickly. I always really feel really bad for the one guy who Grendel kills when he goes in there the first night, just sort of like
red shirt,
and I'm like,
yeah.
And Beowulf's just sitting there like, that's how you treat your friends, huh?
Isn't he asleep when that happens?
Half asleep, maybe. I don't know. It's a
I
little weird.
I feel like if my friend were being eaten or ripped limb from limb, I would probably wake up.
Well, it's not his friend; it's Hrothgar's friend. So
I see.
We can. This is bait. We can spare a guy. The Danes have plenty of them. It's fine.
It's fine. It's fine.
Let him come along.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can see why, too. It is interesting to me, stepping back a bit to the whole critical reception, why I can sense, let's put it this way, why so much of the criticism that Tolkien was responding to was looking at historically, because it's again, maybe much like Lord of the Rings, it's something that's sort of like, it doesn't have a uniform feel, is what it is. I almost sense like, I don't want to say this is like, leave it to the Victorians, but I almost get a sense that sort of like you have a bunch of academics, them going like, what is this chaotic mass? Nah, forget about it. We just want to need it so we can actually analyze this historical stuff, which still gets me, because I'm like, how in the world did they think that something that was a written manuscript from one source, one thing, would be an actual historical document that would be useful? I mean, I can sort of see it in the sense it sort of confirms priors, but that's about it.
Yeah, it kind of misleads you a little bit on its own. I don't know how intentional it is, because we don't have, we have so much information missing here.
Right.
It mentions at least a few historical things. Mm-hmm. The king that Beowulf is like the nephew of or something is like a real person. And I feel like, I may be misremembering, but like Beowulf himself, there are similar people that we know of from Chronicles that weren't like fighting dragons or whatever, but like it is meshing itself with historical sources, which is why it comes across as very important. If you're in that mindset of looking for historical information, it feels like it will tell you more than it does, but it doesn't. So, or like you learn a lot about maybe the mindset and the worldview of the poet in his context, but you're not going to learn anything truly useful about Scandinavia in 500 or whatever it was.
Right.
Yeah, the poet didn't supply us with a map. Thanks, man.
So maybe it would have been more famous earlier if he'd given them a map, and people would have been like, "Oh my God, here's a map! I love this." Everyone
understands exactly, because oh my God, when we first read this in high school, we read this in my 9th grade English class, and I can't remember the translation. It wasn't the Seamus Haney one, but I remember being like, "Where are these? Where is all that?" Like I know where Denmark is, obviously, but like the Yates, it's not super clear. They're in Sweden. Like, are they in Sweden? It's very confusing. And why is someone in the British Isles writing about it? Was very confusing to me.
I feel like we don't really know that part of it, but it is so interesting that it has nothing to do with England, except that the Danes occasionally would attack England. But even then, the Danes are like the victims in Beowulf, which is interesting. I do think this is another really interesting point of intersection with Tolkien's work is, so the end of the poem, Beowulf has defeated the dragon with some help, but in the process has himself died, and the Geats, or like the real pronunciation is like Yats or something like that, but whatever, we'll move on. They build a funeral pyre for him, they burn him. There's this really heart-wrenching scene where a woman is just screaming over his pyre, and it's like, yes, this is an outpouring of grief for the king, and it ends kind of at that point, but a few not a few lines, but like I think slightly before the dragon, somebody is like, the Swedes are going to hear about this and they are going to invade and take over. So at the end of the poem is like very, very beautiful, but part of that is this sense of something is about to end. And it does. Historically, we know that like these were a real people and the Swedes did absorb them. And their name still hangs around in a few places around Scandinavia, but they were conquered by the Swedish. There are, these people don't exist anymore. And that same sense of the passage of a world is all over Tolkien. Everything is on the ruins of something else, and the end of Lord of the Rings is the end of an age. And we don't see what comes after, really, but we know it's not going to be the same, and it might be worse. Despite the return of the king, the long defeat, the elves are going away. When the next time evil arises, the wizards aren't going to be around to help out, the elves aren't going to be able, like, it's... We are facing apocalypse at the end of Lord of the Rings, and it's not stated the same way as in Beowulf, but it is an end. So and that like the end of Beowulf is so, it just gets me every single time. Just like the end of Lord of the Rings, in a very different way, but still.
There is this sense. Is it in the essay, The Monsters and the Critics, or is it somewhere in the commentary? I can't remember which, where Tolkien talks about people of a more historical mindset being like, why are there, like, why Beowulf instead of Ing or Ingeld or you know, like those are the main guys, the main movers and shakers of this era. Like what is this, like, you know, it's sort of like one of the Marvel movies starring, you know, a lesser Marvel character that's kind of a who cares that turns out to be wildly successful. Sort of a weird spin-off. And I think that like we see that sensibility in Tolkien's works, where it's like, who wants a story about some hobbits? Turns out a lot of people do. Like, you know, they're the main draw, not Aragorn the king, unless you're like a weird Silicon Valley dude.
Well, I really want to know what his tax policy is, you know?
Very, very important.
Yeah, this is another main point of The Monsters and the Critics, which is why it's called The Monsters and the Critics, is the importance of the monsters and of the fantastical in Beowulf. And you could not do that if it was about somebody who was well-known and famous and political. It's about the monsters and what they mean. And that's another thing that really, obviously, you can tell attracts him to the poem, is the fantastical element of it.
I mean, and the fact also remains that again, we joke that there are more women in Beowulf than the Hobbit, but it's true. And one of them is Grendel's mom, who is a really fascinating character. Let's face it. Favorite
monster from the poem, and from, like, she ranks pretty high on my list of. I love her so much. Is she even a monster, though? And this is where this is where I think Tolkien has kind of a blind surprise. It's about a woman. Imagine. I mean, it's so shocking. It's so shocking. He thinks of the monsters in the poem as being Grendel and the dragon, and Grendel's mom is just kind of like maybe some cleanup that's happening. Whereas she has a much bigger role in the poem than you would think if you were only reading what he says about her. And this is where Maria Devana Headley's translation, which I keep bringing up, it's the famous, like, the Bro translation. Right. She points out in her introduction that the word that gets used to describe her as something like aglak, or something like that. She's wrote like an aglak weef, this word, woman. When it's applied to Beowulf, or I think Grendel, or the dragon, it's translated as like powerful, strong, cunning, whatever. But when it's applied to Grendel's mother, suddenly it's translated as demon, or it's the demon woman, the demon wife, and everybody else, including Beowulf, gets a positive translation of that, which I would think that that's the kind of thing that would attract his attention, but it doesn't come up at all. In the notes, anywhere, he's just kind of like, I guess she's there too. What we're really interested in is Grendel and the dragon. Which, come on, man.
Well, you know, but yeah, I mean, the sense of human motivation, ironically, in her is kind of good. It's one of those things, you know, Grendel, well, you know, he eats and other things like this. Grendel's mom is like, you killed my baby boy, screw you. You know?
Headley points out that Grendel's mother is obeying the rules of like a blood feud.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like they kill her son,
Mm-hmm.
she goes and kills one guy,
Mm-hmm.
and that's it. And like reclaims her son's arm that Beowulf tore off in the struggle, and goes home. She is just there for this one thing, and the response to her is an armed party riding out to the mere where she lives, which does not happen for Grendel.
Yeah, they
And
don't go get
it's
him.
weird. Yeah.
They
It's
apparently
such a-
knew where he lived. Like,
Well, I don't know
he
if they
couldn't have
knew.
been that hard to track. If they can track Grendel's mom, they could track.
Well, they follow the trail of blood that
Surely
he leaves.
Grendel left
but, like-
a trail of blood. Surely, like.
You would think, yeah.
Well, you know, the dare I say, the true logical problem I have with Beowulf, obviously, is the fact that Hrothgar has been sitting around for 12 years trying to do something like this. It's like,
I mean, it's fairy tale rules. you know?
yeah, of course, exactly.
Like, it has to happen that way so that Beowulf can show up. Like, it's just, this is how it is. Although, I will say, it is pointed out in the poem that Beowulf is as strong as 30 men, and Grendel cannot be harmed by weapons, so the only thing that can harm him is some guy who is really, really strong, and if you don't have one of those just lying around, you just got to deal with the monsters.
Just don't sleep in the hall at night.
Yeah, which they don't. Like, they're like, you know, after the first few people get their heads ripped off or whatever, we're gonna leave it abandoned at night.
I guess it also makes sense too, because Beowulf's strength is like, you know, the power of an extra man per year that he's alive, right? Was that it? Did I misread that?
Did I misread it? Because if that's in there, I had no idea.
Is that in one of the commentary things? Okay, well, now I feel like, I swear to God that I read that somewhere. So it would make sense that, like, as an 18-year-old, you know, you want to level up another 12 years worth of strength, I guess.
Boost it up a bit, so...
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Maybe was...
It's like a D&D game. You got to, like, this enemy is too strong. You got to go do some side quests and level up, and then come back to
Maybe to include another, you know, Tolkien-friendly note, we got a talking dragon. This dragon is not quite Smaug's talking, but it's you know, he has things to say.
Wait, does he?
Doesn't he?
Am I losing all credibility here? Because I feel like the dragon. One of the big changes for the Hobbit is that Smaug talks.
Wow, am I wrong? I thought maybe I am wrong. Jeez, I was
Yeah,
under the
this
impression
dragon
the
is
dragon
just
talked.
sitting there.
Is that the one in Does the one in Selleck's Spell talk? By the way, I enjoyed that. I enjoyed Selleck's Spell,
you
which
know,
is his
Yeah.
word.
It was
Maybe
nice.
let's talk about that instead of my idiocy if I got something wrong. So, I was convinced he talked, which shows you how closely I was reading the translation. Oh, sorry about that. So, you might be right. Never mind.
I think he's not actually speaking.
Yeah. So the
He's
Night
well
Nerves is-
drawn, though. He seems like he could.
Right, yeah.
He has the dragon has so much for a thing that doesn't talk. Has so much personality. I love it. How it's like described as like sniffing around the gold to see who was here, and like the way he I forget the actual wording used, but the way that the dragon moves is like like a sidewinder almost, just like coiling and uncoiling as it like races towards its goal. And it's so powerful. The way it's described, it's so great.
This is true, yes. Ignore
Beowulf
my
is
earlier
good,
thought.
y'all.
Yeah. It's good stuff, yes. Okay, so not talking dragon, but personality dragon. He conveyed it through mime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's the way it is. So, okay, so much for my credibility.
I feel like we've all biffed something. Actually, Jared hasn't biffed any.
We are not Beowulf scholars.
The influence of Beowulf and Lord of the Rings is such that's like, who wrote it exactly? You know, who did who? So
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that maybe I'm biffing it now. Maybe it's my turn, but I feel like the influence of Smaug is such that now we assume a fantasy dragon.
Right. Yeah. I can buy that.
Whereas maybe before The Hobbit, there were probably talking dragons, but The Hobbit is the one that like, no, this is how dragons are.
Yeah,
like, it codified that.
I mean, you have stuff like I don't know. Actually, I'm going to check right now. When did the Reluctant Dragon come out? That was. And that was, okay, The Reluctant Dragon came out in 1898, Kenneth Graham, Wind of the Willows, etc., things like that. So the idea of talking dragons certainly existed.
I know he didn't invent it, but I feel like he
kind of,
cemented a particular kind of, like, slithery, devilish eloquent, kind of. Yeah.
Very elitist. Very commanding. So we could go on. So, well, we're coming a little close to the wrap-up of time. I will throw in my last thought, well, maybe a two-parter. First, I agree, Selleck Spell, which is Tolkien's very, very wonderfully brusque and weird version of Beowulf that he writes for himself. Yeah, Beowulf in that one. The whole origin is sort of like, wow, you took a sort of like, crabby, crazy character from the original and you made him even worse, and yet he's still the hero?
Do you want to explain what Selleck Spell is for everybody?
Okay, so Selleck Spell is essentially there are a couple of versions that are alluded to by Christopher Tolkien that were written up, but basically it is a version of the Beowulf story, but it's told in the form of a sort of fairy story. It literally begins, once upon a time there was a king in the north of the world, and in his house there was a young lad who was not like other young lads. That's how one version of it begins, is presented. And the idea that Beowulf or Beowulf in this telling is a foundling and is sort of taken in, but he's sort of not quite like any of the other ones, and eventually he goes on a series of adventures with companions even who meet various bad fates, and they go to the Herod equivalent, meet Hrothgar. The fight against Grendel happens, a fight against the mom happens, and eventually Beowulf just comes back and marries the king's daughter and lives happily ever after. And the tone of it is wonderfully strange. The Beowulf is not quite so heroic. At the same time, he's not seen to be, I don't want to say he's not seen to be a bad guy. He kind of is, really. It's just a very, very, it's a weirdly negative read on a poem that he kind of really liked. I was sort of like very intrigued by it. I'm like, that was kind of my view.
It's his theoretical reconstruction of like what the original fairy tale kind of like the original story, heavy air quotes, of Beowulf how it might have looked,
right?
And what the poet then adapts to produce the poem Beowulf that we know now. Mm-hmm. So it does have a lot more of a fairy tale aspect, where it's like there's the companions and each of them like meets his end, and Beowulf like learns from that, and like from there is able to. That's like the rule of threes thing that doesn't really happen in the version that the poem that we have. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so funny, and the way he literally translates a lot of names like Beowulf or
Grinder.
Yeah.
We're just having some fun,
We're just having fun, And then he wrote the entire thing in Old English just to show off, which is like,
it's like, sure, of course.
Come on.
Why wouldn't you?
I do always wonder with stuff like that, like, were there people who told him he was wrong about anything? Was he wrong? Because, like, we all make mistakes. I mean, we all make mistakes. Did he make mistakes? Were people, like, I don't really know enough about this field to know if, like, anyone saw that. Like, did he show it to anyone and they were like,
I feel like he just kind of kept it to himself. I don't think it didn't go anywhere.
I mean, it would be interesting to sort of see what his Monster and the Critics essay produced in the form of response from people he was specifically calling out, if indeed any were still alive responding to. It could have well been they were like, we might have gotten some classic, dare I say, stereotypically English reactions. What are you saying over there, young scholar? Things like that.
As my learned colleague Tolkien has said, I will. Yeah. Shots fired.
But beyond that, the only other thing I was going to say is that it is interesting. Certainly, Tolkien having really reset the idea of thinking about Beowulf, and Beowulf having come, I would argue, much more of a popular referred thing. All the more, even so, as a result, especially in the wake of, Lord of the Rings success and things like that, is that, it was the type of thing that when I was growing up, I would read, almost kid adaptations of the story and things like that. The most weirdly fascinating version of the story, which you two might well know about, is the one that took me by surprise, because I still remember just reading this years ago. It's Michael Crichton's book, Eaters of the Dead.
I've heard of it.
Yes, itself is simply a retelling of, and I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, a noted Arab traveler, a Muslim Arab in the 10th century, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, I believe is how it's pronounced, and which is an actual historical document. He went from Baghdad up north into the area of the Volga and all that. Is that Michael Crichton, without giving anything away, basically presents a translation version of that, or a redaction, I don't know, and then he extends the story, and then our character ends up at Harrod Hall, where Grendel is causing problems. So it becomes the Beowulf story from this observer's eye. eyes, and his own riff on it. And it's Michael Crichton on the one hand, but at the same time, if there's something Michael Crichton knows how to do, it's to tell a pretty rippingly good story, is what it is. And I remember it being sort of like, okay, you can't come into this thinking you're getting anything scholarly, but this is actually not a bad conceit. I kind of like it. It's kind of my thing. It was made into a terrible film called The 13th Warrior in 1999 with Antonio Banderas. Don't watch that.
Oh, that... I haven't seen it, but that's okay.
That's what that film is. It is based on specifically Crichton's Eaters of the Dead. It was because for the longest time it was like the only book of Crichton's that hadn't been made into a movie, and then someone finally did it. So
fascinating.
Yeah, so there's that. But anyway, so with my skew whiff thought, that's my final thought on Tolkien and Beowulf for now.
Real quick, if you haven't read Beowulf, it's honestly worth a read. I do think you should get the bilingual edition of the Seamus Heaney one. I love, I actually made my own little attempt to translate a few pages of it. Well, this was, I want to say I was in college, or actually, no, I think I was still in high school, and using, I don't really know what resource for the Old English, to look up Old English words. I don't really know. I don't remember, probably all wrong. But that was very fun, and it was all really interesting. It unlocked, this is where, Tolkien just stole all these names from here, okay. And it was really fun to have that experience replicated, starting to learn Finnish and going a lot of Elvish is just pulled straight from the Finnish. This is good artist steal, but not, just from, publicly available corpuses, not actual artworks.
I think the last thing I wanted to bring up, because this is a line that just pile drove itself into my skull. I feel like The Monsters and the Critics could not have been written as it is by somebody who hadn't been through a gigantic war. Because there's a whole thing about courage in there, and the northern emphasis on courage and battle and stuff like that, which is super interesting, and it's too bad we don't really have time to get into it. But he pulls out this sentence that has been popping up in my head for days now, just randomly. He's just the wages of heroism is death. And I was oh my god, you saw some shit, didn't you?
Okay, the time has come for the next episode topic. The choice of topic has come back around to me, and my companions here are slightly fearing. They should fear.
I don't like the look on Ned's face right now. I don't like it at all.
Next episode, our 61st episode, even though that doesn't seem like an anniversary, it is our 5th anniversary episode. So we have reached a new milestone here. 5 years of this podcast.
Wow.
Crazy enough to think about. You might recall, if you've been a long-time listener, that whenever we do that, because it's in April, I like to do sort of April Fool type stuff. And for the past couple of years, we've gone through various varying quality of Tolkien animations that were done in the late 70s and early 80s, thanks to Rankin Bass and Bakshi. But you might remember that, if you're listening long enough, that the first time around we did the Silver Call duology by Dennis McKiernan, the sort of fake sequel to Lord of the Rings. And after all, in our introduction all these years, we talked about how we're going to talk about everything, including ripoffs and parodies.
Oh no!
I think you kind of know already, Jared, where this might be leading, because it's time for one of the big ones. It's time for the biggest one, maybe, especially one that in recent years has gotten due attention or new attention just because of how instrumental it was for a whole lot of things that came out. We are going to do 1977's Terry Brooks's The Sword of Shannara.
Oh! No, that is not what I was thinking.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I thought that
I still don't want to.
I thought
don't
you were
want to,
do
it's not
Board
what
of the
I was
Rings.
Thinking.
I
thought so too.
absolutely
I thought it was going to be Board of the Rings.
You had me going there.
Good.
This is worse, though. I don't want to read.
I said rip-offs and parodies. Remember? And, arguably Sword of Shannara is a parody. It is distinctly a rip-off.
God.
So, well, I'm glad not to have terrified you too much there, Jared, but yes, no, you don't want to read this, but we are, because there are
Because you're a
reasons to read
sadist,
it,
that's
because
why.
it is instrumental in fantasy, and here's how we do it, how it's conceived, and it certainly wouldn't exist if it didn't have something to rip off, and by God, does it ever. And it is worthy of an April Fool's. To make it even more enticing for you all, and if anyone listening along wants to give in on this, one of the reasons why is that it is arguably the Fleetwood Mac rumors of its day, in that there are 8 million copies of the original edition floating around that you can get for a song. This is important because there are illustrations. I'll be sending you guys copies.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
And we'll get into that more off recording when it comes to your addresses and things like that. Anyway, so we are going to talk about one of the world's most egregious ripoffs ever, and its role in developing modern fantasy, and where Tolkien sort of comes into it in its own indirect way. And hopefully after that we'll never speak about it again, but we'll have fun speaking about it next time. So gear on up. We will talk about it then. Thank you all very much for listening. We really appreciate it, as always. Again, you can find us now that Blue Sky is formally open to everybody. Again, our main site as such is the Blue Sky account, By-The-Bywater. We are also on there individually as well. Maybe we'll finally get around to recording a new outro properly one of these days. We'll see. So, and we can start playing that again. As always, our main page is megaphonic.fm/by-the-bywater. Do consider joining the Megaphonic Patreon. That way you can join us and the Discord, where we share all sorts of stuff, memes, comments, many other things besides. We always welcome your thoughts. We do appreciate it. And, of course, bythebywater@gmail.com is how you can get a hold of us directly. Until next time, we thank you very much for listening. We will come back to you in a month. Until then.